Hi, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to take this opportunity to share some of my perspectives with you from this week's studies on the 1960s. Uh, Having lived through that, it looks differently to me, probably, and some of you who lived through it as well, than to just merely read it in a history book. You don't really get the pain of the trouble or the problems that we encountered in the 1960s quite in the same vein from a written record that you do from having seen the rioting and all the things that happened. The 1960s was quite an interesting decade. It was a nexus, if you will, of events that are going to propel us into the latter part of the 20th century and raise questions and issues about how we live and what our real meaning of life was all about as Americans. It seems like as you look at American history, we have these points where we're really questioned to the very core of our being as far as understanding what life is about and how we're living as Americans. The 1920s was the first one of those events in which, after World War One, of which we only played a one-year role out of four, but we did help in winning the peace in Europe and ended up becoming the major player on the world stage at the end of World War One. As we go into World War Two, we've just come out of the Great Depression, and we are, still recovering from that. The war actually helps us to recover from the Great Depression, and we go through World War Two and the Cold War, and we come out of that kind of jaded in our views of what the world is going to be like. It's amazing that as we think about worldviews, we realize that this is actually what we need to think about when we think about the Cold War. We have two distinctly different worldviews, and I realize that some of you, as you've read your materials, don't get the same impression, but we're battling here for the soul of humanity, whether we're going to be slaves to a totalitarian system that assigns people where they live, where they work, what they eat, what they drive, or we're going to live in freedom and we're going to have some measure of choice in what we do. And of course, you and I both know as we look at American history is not perfect, but it's certainly you don't see people trying to escape from America to go somewhere else. You generally see them trying to escape other places, trying to come to us. So that speaks volumes when you look at it over a historical perspective. Is where do people want to be? They certainly don't want to be in a place with less rights. As we come to the 1960s, of course, with the Kennedy election in 1960, we're immediately confronted with these two world ideologies and these two world views, and you come to understand that people how they think determines what they do. And America will go through a very testing time in the 60s on many different fronts. First of all, the big movement of civil rights started actually in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which made segregated schools uh, unconstitutional. It's going to take some time for that to happen. The ruling said that they wanted the schools to be desegregated with all haste. I actually lived through desegregation. 1972 is when we finally get desegregation in South Carolina. I was an eighth grader, and I remember it so well. There was hardly a blip on the radar when our African American students joined the white students in our school. We had a previous event where we closed a country high school, and we had a lot more problem with the rednecks integrating than we ever did with the African American students. But South Carolina, for all of its blunderbuss, and you have to understand, South Carolina is the first in protest, the first state to leave the Union after the election of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. And it seems like we're always talking, and but then when we come down to it, it's not nearly as off-putting as we would think it would have been. So I lived through desegregation and civil rights we watched on TV. Other states did not have the luxury that we did. In Mississippi, Alabama, some parts of Georgia, you had police using water cannons and dogs and all kind of things against civil rights protesters. Dr. Martin Luther King was jailed numerous times for his peaceful protest. But anyways, that's one of the major events of the 1960s. But there were others. The Vietnam War protest is going to be very big on the Spectre 1960s, late 60s, as it looks like we are in what will become an unwinnable war. We had been playing around in Vietnam since 1954 as the French exit and kind of leave us holding the bag there. And we're part of Truman's domino theory that if we don't stop these countries from tripping into communism, that they're going to take over the world. And there was a real major threat. I cannot emphasize to you the threat there was of communism taking over the world. It started with Stalin in Russia, and it was just Russia then, sitting on most of the Eastern European countries after World War II. And as I've said in the discussion boards repeatedly, he's determined. That's what Truman discovers at Yalta. He determined that he is not giving up 1 inch of ground because, by his determination, they've been attacked by the Germans twice and they need a buffer. And so the Eastern European countries are going to fall to the Soviet bloc, which becomes the Soviet Union. We end up dividing Berlin between the communist and the free world, causing the Berlin Wall to be built in 1961, which is going to be a major issue up until 1991. So it gets into current times. And so the Cold War is going to be these two titans of the world locked into a worldview that's totally polar, totally opposite. We have spies on both sides as we talk about the Rosenbergs and different ones. The Rosenbergs were executed for spying for the Russians in the 1950s. We have a panel in the Senate that is looking at communist infiltrators in our government and in Hollywood. Hollywood has always been looked at as kind of a left-leaning, very liberal group of people. And so there was some concerns about the movies they're producing, were they communist propaganda? And so those people that were brought before those committees in America, mind you, many of them never were allowed to work again because of the aspersions that were put on them that they were communists or former communists. And so this is going on in the mid-50s. We get to the election of Kennedy in 1960, of course. It's not an easy election for him. He wins against allegations that he has mob connections, that he's Roman Catholic. That's another big thing that's an issue. But he does win against Richard Nixon. And so Kennedy will do something that Democrats had not done up until that point. And you have to understand something of the political leanings at that point in time. From construction or Reconstruction up until about 1964, the Republican Party was largely African American and Northern, and the Democrats were the Southern, more racist, anti-black makeup. And so Kennedy runs in that party, but he and Lyndon Johnson later will become the proponents of civil rights. And so there's going to be a switch between 1964, when Barry Goldwater runs on the Republican ticket against Lyndon Johnson. There's going to be a major switching of parties. Ronald Reagan in 1964 is a Republican, and he says it's time to choose. So basically there's going to be a shift between 64 and 68 in the American elections, on which Richard Nixon is going to win by a landslide for the Republican Party, taking both southern states and northern states. Barry Goldwater will win just a handful of southern states and break the mold, and Richard Nixon will set up what's called the Southern Strategy. So you're going to see a major shift in the political structure in America, which kind of portends the other things that are going on with civil rights and with the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon will, of course, end the Vietnam War, and that will be the first war that we've ever lost. And those soldiers come back to be spit on and mistreated and never really getting their just dues for the sacrifices that they made for the country. One of the things that agitated the fact was this was the first war in which bodies were being brought back to America from foreign fields. We'd never seen that before. World War II, the bodies were buried in Flanders or wherever they were, where they fell. And we have giant cemeteries at D-Day and all those places where we have American soldiers lying there in repose there. So that's going to agitate the American people. Interestingly enough, it feeds these protests and these marches on college campuses against the Vietnam War. Sadly, you could be 18 years old then and you could go to war and give your life for your country, but you couldn't buy beer in a tavern. So, I was within 6 months of being drafted to Vietnam when the war ended, and did not have to go. But then you had other people like Bill Clinton, who burned his draft card, fled to Canada, and escaped the war. Bill Clinton would not have been elected to the presidency in the 70s and maybe the 80s. And so it's a mark when he is elected that people have kind of gotten over, or maybe becoming less patriotic or less centered in that kind of a milieu. Other things in the 60s to mention, of course, is the Equal Rights Amendment. Women will kind of reconnect to the political process because they really haven't done a great deal since 1921 when they got the right to vote. But in 1960s, they were really tired of being second-rate citizens, not being paid as much as a man, not being allowed to be educated like a man. And so the National Organization for Women was founded to begin to work for the Equal Rights Amendment. Equal Rights Amendment, interestingly enough, was passed by both houses of Congress, signed by the president, and extended by President Jimmy Carter later, but it had to be ratified by 2/3 of the majority of the states. And so many states did ratify it until we get closer into 1960, end of 60s, early 70s, when the Christian right begins to form. It had started, some concerns had started in the early 1960s with removing of prayer and Bible reading from public schools. And the Christian right didn't really get involved in civil rights, but it did get involved in women's rights. And a Christian woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, and her organization was called Eagle Forum, single-handedly defeated the Equal Rights Amendment by scaring people into thinking, well, if this is passed, women won't be home to fix your supper or to do your laundry. They're going to be out working, and they're going to be drafted into the military. And so it really scared people to the point that even states that had passed the Equal Rights Amendment rescinded it. And so it was soundly defeated, and to this day has never been restarted. So that tells you something. Beginning around 1970, there's also other groups are going to ride on the coattails of civil rights. Women's rights do that. Native Americans, for the first time, are going to begin to gain some traction for regaining their rights, getting back some of their sacred lands, and things like that. And so you're going to see Native American protests at Alcatraz. They actually take over the prison and kind of hold it hostage for quite a while to draw attention to Native American rights. And then, of course, there is the Christian right that begins to form. Early 19th and gay rights actually comes out of the milieu of the 60s as well. The riots and things that happened are going to cause the gays to begin to work toward their civil rights as well. This kind of brings other Christians to the forefront. Anita Bryant, who was a famous actress, singer, commercial person, she represented the whole entire orange juice industry in the state of Florida, came out against gay rights and actually began that movement as part of an anti-gay movement among Christians. And so that's going to coalesce early 70s. And then 1973, the Roe versus Wade decision, making it legal to perform abortions, will be passed, and Jerry Falwell will form the moral majority. So going into the 70s, you're going to see the Christian right become much more active in politics. When Richard Nixon is forced to resign and Jimmy Carter is running, they will endorse him because he carries the mantle of being born again as a Christian, and they assumed that he would be for their issues. They were sadly disappointed because Jimmy Carter is a very progressive Baptist. He believed in gay rights. He believed in equal rights for women. And so they were disappointed in him, and they're going to attach themselves to Ronald Reagan in 1980. And then in 84, they will kind of meld themselves together with the Republican Party. And by 89, Falwell will dissolve the moral majority, saying that the Republican Party will now carry the banner forward. And interestingly enough, we got Donald Trump basically on that basis, that there were three important evangelical pastors that endorsed him as being saved, a Christian, the one that Christians can vote for. And so he got the large Christian vote that put him in office, howbeit he didn't portray any lifestyle that might be considered Christian or anything else. But they did put him in power, and they have defended him still. So you see, the things that come out of the 60s are going to propel us into 2021 quite interestingly. So I hope that maybe some of my perspective might find resonance with you. Feel free to email me. Feel free to raise questions or counterpoints that you don't agree with. I'm always up for discussions and things that advance our learning and our understanding. We're not here to be enemies. We're here to increase each other's learning and abilities. And so that's really my point in doing these from my perspective sections, to kind of give you a different perspective maybe than you get from the book, or one that, from someone who's kind of lived through many of these things. And they do look differently, as I said, to someone who's lived through them and walked in our shoes. You see things, they're much more potent than maybe just reading them in a book. And maybe we bring perspectives that the book doesn't, and it might help you to have greater understanding. So thank you so much for your dedication to the discussion boards, not only this week, but in this term. And we've had some really great discussions, and I appreciate it so much. I hope you'll continue to read and learn about this period as you go forward. You now have this little postage stamp of a foundation upon which to build. So read around that, build that into an intellectual foundation that you can learn from. And as I've said before, one of the great ways to learn American history is by reading presidential biographies. And I do think you would be very much benefited by reading about JFK and Lyndon Johnson and Nixon and Carter and Reagan and Bush and all these other guys, to learn what their motivations were for what they did. Thank you so much. And if I can help you, please let me know.